Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it is the 19th of February, 2012, and I'm here with Audrey Waters from Hack Education. Thanks for
Cool.
being here, Audrey.
Oh, thanks, Steve.
You've had a prolific week.
I have been I have been prolific.
You've kept me busy.
So much for cutting back on. Oh, I didn't say I was cutting back on my writing. Just cutting back on writing elsewhere. So
Well, it was all very interesting. I wanted to start with something. I was on a plane this week, and I've been reading a book called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn because my eighth grade daughter is reading it. I had never read it. And I was alternating between reading that and reading a book called Learning by Heart by Roland Barthes. And I made a big note in the margin of Learning by Heart. He talks a lot about teachers as learners and principals as learners. And I said, wouldn't it be amazing if the principal came in to the history class because he was really interested in, say, a certain thing about World War II and actually was a student in the class of the history teacher? And then I didn't open my book because I was on a Kindle. I read a chapter in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn where the janitor goes in and attends one of the classes with the students. And I thought, wow, what a vision.
yeah, I think that this recognition that that we need. I think we hear a lot of lip service about lifelong learning, and I do mean lip service. I mean, I think that people sort of talk a lot about it, and that we really actually, I think, very few of us sort of walk the walk when it comes to sort of to putting ourselves in the in the seats, so to speak, as students.
One of the great points that Roland makes is that universities do this very well, that the students see the faculty and see them as learners because the faculty are working out problems at that time. And I think we're going to get to this when we start talking about MITx. But before we do so, there's a story that you were almost not going to tell,
Right.
but you did tell it. So tell us about Airy Labs.
Well, this, I've sort of had some sort of inside news about a education gaming startup that was sort of hit the rocks. And I'd spoken to several people who were employees there that sort of said, things are going very poorly here, and it looks as though there were some posts online about sort of mismanagement at the startup. And I thought I didn't really want to be the person to sort of break the news, partially because I feel like there's mismanagement at startups all the time. Startups fail all the time, and I felt sort of too close to the story to talk about it. But after TechCrunch wrote the story and broke the news, and I feel like it is an important story to tell, in no small part because the CEO and founder is one of Peter Thiel's fellows, one of the 20 young students, 20 under age 20, that Peter Thiel paid $100,000 to drop out of school. And I was really, I'm really mortified at the fact that we could, that a startup could implode in such a spectacular way with no sort of guidance and mentorship and leadership from other people in the entrepreneurial community or in the education technology entrepreneurial community, or particularly from the Thiel Foundation, which I felt, gave a bunch of students money and clearly hasn't been giving them any sort of guidance on how to actually become an entrepreneur. I felt it was very irresponsible all around, and irresponsible on the part of sort of the parents involved, investors involved, and the Thiel Foundation. And I feel I feel bad because these are young, very very young kids who are involved in this.
So, at one level, this story may be getting more play than it deserves because it's really not relevant to learning. I mean, it's about bad management. But at the other level, it's a window into what you call the ridiculous Silicon Valley hubris and kind of the money driving here, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, and there's this there's this real mythology, right? That what we need to solve the problems of the future are young, sort of young blood, and anybody sort of once you've hit I mean, I would say sort of once you've hit 25 in Silicon Valley, you're a wash up, right? And I would say too that there's a real powerful story that college dropouts are somehow the key to a more innovative entrepreneurial future. And of course, you can sort of point to a few well-known college dropouts in terms of sort of Silicon Valley mythology, but I think that all of that seems to sort of have coincided with some, high times in Silicon Valley where everyone's sort of making money hand over fist, so it appears, and without really sort of any responsibility of looking more critically at what they're building, how they're building, and sort of the bottom line, not just in terms of the pocketbook, but so sort of your responsibility to your community.
I think this is some of the best writing I've read from you. I want to read a quote from this post. It's the one that says that the young and high-scoring IQ and the Ivy League sanction know the best way forward. I mean, why ask someone who spent 20 years in the trenches as a teacher how to fix education? Let's instead ask 20-year-olds to come up with a fix for education and, of course, provide a healthy return on investment as they do so. It reminded me of Teach for America a little.
Well, and I think that these are some of these models that we're seeing sort of spin up right now. Is that that you can that we are we're expecting young and high energy kids, and I was actually sort of blasted by another Thiel fellow for calling them kids, but I'm sorry. Anyone who's my son's age is like, they're a kid. But I think that we're asking kids without a lot of experience to shoulder a lot of responsibility for moving things forward, and at the same time severing the relationship with adults. Grown-ups again was sort of perhaps a bad term to describe it, but with people who do actually have experience and do have some wisdom to share. And I think that it's all well and good to sort of support sort of young folks doing innovative things, but there still are lessons to be learned and ways in which folks who've sort of gone before have really important insights. Even if we haven't sort of radically changed the world quite right, we do sort of know some things about how the world works.
Yeah, it's kind of intriguing because if you think about if you think from the perspective that I believe that you and I come from, it feels like a lot of the problems in education are the result of political and policy decisions related to high stakes testing, and that those problems aren't necessarily ones that need to be solved by technology. They're in large part the result of misguided thinking about how to get results.
I think that that's precisely right, and I think that part of the danger when you think of education as it's not just sort of education requiring a technology fix, that it's actually like a technology product fix. So it isn't as though it's not enough to sort of say, we'll put computers in the classroom and that's going to, quote, fix education. But it really is down to sort of specific hardware sales, specific software sales, and this is a product, like that a product is going to solve. It's sort of like, it's like the pharmaceutical industry. It's, we have a pill to solve every possible symptom you could ever complain about.
Fascinating. There's also kind of a secondary shadow feature to this story, right? Which is that that we've been told there's a little bit of a glamour version about what's happening in the adventure world in Silicon Valley, and then there's the reality. Was this a little bit of the reality peeking through?
I think this is very much of the reality, and and part of that reality is that, again, startups fail all the time. And I think that everyone is so exuberant right now about the possibility of becoming sort of the next Mark Zuckerberg with your web tech startup, that I think that we sort of forget, we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves, and particularly when that comes to investors' money. And although, perhaps I was unclear. Peter Thiel didn't invest quote take an investment stake in these kids' future, but he did give them sort of a first investment in them. And I think that we're seeing so much money being thrown around that that I think it's going to. I think it's going to end poorly. I mean, it's ended badly before. This isn't the first time it's happened.
Interesting. Okay, we get to talk about robot grading again.
We do.
MIT has opened registration for its first MITx online course. What's going on?
So they announced, this was a very late 2011 announcement, MITx, and it seemed clear at the time to be a competitor with Stanford's massive online classes, and now with Udacity, another sort of effort to sort of have online education offered for free to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students. This is under the MIT brand, sort of. You'll get, if you complete the class, you'll get a certificate that says you completed an MITx class. But that when the plan was first revealed, MIT said that they were going to charge for that certification. So the class itself would be free, right? The information, the knowledge, the instruction would be free. But if you wanted the piece of paper, the not degree, but if you wanted the piece of paper, you would have to pay for it. For this first class, they aren't charging anything. But again, this is an example of, in order to sort of, so the argument goes, in order to scale to the level of hundreds of thousands of students, this requires an artificial intelligence grading machine to do so.
It was very interesting for me to read the Roland Barthes statement about the value of universities as being a highly transparent and visible learning environment. And I'm still not sold yet on these courses, and I hope there's a piece here that I'm missing. But is it possible that this is a case of even though you have the technology, doesn't mean it's necessarily the best thing to do?
I'm going to be very interested in seeing sort of how this moves forward. I mean, because I'm a huge supporter of MIT OpenCourseWare. I think it is probably it's such an important initiative, and I'm very interested in the way in which the MITx is actually situated in the OpenCourseWare offerings from MIT. So they're making sure that, for example, the prerequisites to this class, the MITx class, are offered as OpenCourseWare Scholar classes, something we've talked about before. So I think it is this new interesting sort of development in OpenCourseWare. But again, I'm not sure what I think about. I'm not sure what I think about scaling like this. I think that it's great to sort of have content, educational content, be available, widely distributed, open, free, accessible. But I don't know what I think. I'm not sold on the idea that teaching and learning are scalable the same way that the delivery of electronic dissemination of educational content is. If that makes sense. I think there's a distinction. I hope there's a distinction.
I'm sure we'll be figuring that out. Okay, so tell me what Inkling is doing. Matt McInnes, CEO and founder, says originally it's about disassembling the textbook. You seem to indicate now that it's about the production and human processes that go into bookmaking. Are these the same stories?
Inkling is an interesting company, and Matt is particularly interesting because he worked at Apple for a very long time, and I think that had Matt stayed at Apple, I think the textbook announcement from Apple would have been a very different one. I think that the Inkling textbooks are quite different than just sort of digitizing, making a PDF and sticking it onto the iPad. They really are sort of taking apart a textbook in an interesting way. So what Inkling announced this week is that they're actually opening up the technology that runs their publishing platform to other publishers. So this isn't like the Apple iBooks Author. This isn't sort of a DIY publishing tool, but this is a way that other publishers can take advantage of the Inkling platform, which is cloud-based. It's a way that, I mean, in some ways, even though desktop publishing changed publishing dramatically, there's still a lot of, if you've ever published a book or even an article, there's still a lot of emailing of PDFs and handwritten comments that must be transcribed back into a system. It's still actually a very slow and bulky process. So in some ways, Inkling is just sort of streamlining the publishing process by having it be sort of cloud-based, a one access point for publishers and writers and illustrators and designers to work together. But on the other hand, I think there is this notion that Matt thinks about content and in these little pieces, in that disassembling and re-engineering way. And so he told me that this was a semantic publishing platform, which I think is sort of interesting, thinking about sort of the semantic web and the way in which we'll be able to connect information in new ways because of technology.
It's hard for me to fully feel like I can understand that. Disassembling the textbook was a message that I really connected with. Mm-hmm. But this is a little bit more complex, and I'll be interested to see if it if I come to it with a little bit more understanding as the story moves on. I keep thinking about live binders, mm-hmm. right? And the aggregation of content that's already on the web, that's already been kind of published in some form. Is live binders a part of that disassembly? I mean, is that kind of the beginning of the textbook as a disassembled product?
I think it is. I think that live binder still very much focuses on the content, and I think once you have the semantic element to it, it means that you're going to be connected to some of the you can sort of connect the metadata around content. So it's not just sort of looking at pulling together content but it's also thinking about how do you pull together content based on some of the other ways in which you can think of it. So it's not just sort of, this is an example of a good biology website, but this is a 8th grade biology website that addresses this particular topic in this particular way with hands-on experimentation. So there's just more data for you to sort of assess how those learning objects are interesting or important to you.
I'm glad you understand it. Because if I had to make a choice between the metadata piece and the ability to have conversation around the existing content, I've seen so many projects that tried so hard to organize at such a high level, but then never actually gained traction. And I keep thinking, aren't we learning that it's about the conversation?
I think that perhaps this is sort of the folklorist and the archivist in me, that I and someone who sort of the would-be librarian, that I think that there's something about like having, the beauty of the card catalog is you want to actually have, be able to find your title by approaching it for a number of different searches in the card catalog, whether it's author, date, subject, topic, and so on. So I think that the metadata piece I think is important for discovery. But I mean, of course, I think that I would rather have conversations as well. But I do like my card catalog.
Well, Matt's messing up my fire your textbook phrase. Okay, so another area in which I'm going to admit just not fully understanding the appeal is the LMS plus the App Store. That seems to really appeal to you, so help me understand it.
Well, the LMS does not appeal to me at all. In fact, if I had a nickel for every time I was pitched a story on an ed tech startup building an LMS, I would be a very, very, very rich woman. I think that the learning management system as a whole is sort of a sort of need, much like we could sort of fire the textbooks, we should sort of perhaps fire the LMS as well. I think what's interesting about the LMS plus App Store in this case is this App Store piece. And I don't know that this is a startup called Chalkable. They're very, very new out of the gate. I don't think that they've nailed it yet, but I do think that they're thinking about some pretty important issues. The main one being how do you discover good educational content, particularly as we move to the App Store. It's really tricky to find. It's not. I don't just mean sort of age appropriate content in the iTunes store, for example, but quality content that meets a need for a specific grade or specific topic. So I think discovering good content is really important, and then I think sort of getting it easily into the hands of a classroom is another challenge as well. We've talked about this before, that that a lot of these devices, the iPad and even the Android, they're really geared towards an individual consumer and not to having things work well in a school setting. So I think it's an interesting opportunity. I'm not sure if Chalkable will be the folks to do it, but then I think integrating the software fully with with some of your grade book and other student information systems things too. They're taking on everybody. I mean, like I think I said in that story, they are taking on Pearson, Amazon, Google, Apple. So go team. Good luck.
Well, I remember the flack that Bezos got at Amazon when nobody understood the model. So with some humility, my saying I don't understand the model doesn't mean they're not doing a really cool or interesting thing. The app piece is very interesting because it feels as though it's the complexity of this app environment keeps growing. First, there was this concern about the kind of gatekeeping function that the app marketplaces provide, and the sort of the tariff involved in anything coming into the iPhone. Right. Then there's the question of the storing of your personal data when you've allowed the app to look for your friends.
Right.
Right. And these sort of recent revelations about these companies storing all of this data. And now this question, from the FTC about apps and COPPA.
Right.
Right. So it feels like this is getting pretty darn complicated.
I think it's getting really complicated. And I think that, that's not even discussing sort of how do you actually get 25 copies of a particular app, whether it's a web app or a native app on a mobile device. How do you get those into the hands of your students? I think that there's all sorts of sort of technological, billing, privacy hurdles that we have to work out.
I guess we'll be leading into the HTML5 discussion, but it would be interesting to see if this actually ends up being a non-issue as HTML5 becomes more prevalent.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that this is sort of, these are some of the questions that I've been sort of asking folks about that, and I don't actually know. I mean, I think that the folks who are interested in the web are perhaps on a different team than folks who are interested in some of these native apps.
Okay, so I knew there was a story you weren't breaking, right? That you ended up talking about the Erie Labs.
Yes.
Then there was a story that you alluded to last week that you were going to be a part of.
Yes.
And that's obviously this iPads in Auburn, Maine.
Yes.
So tell us about that.
Well, I remember at the beginning of the year when we talked about my predictions, and I said to you, we're going to see a study come out that has found that iPads make no difference in learning, and I was fully convinced that was going to be what the folks in Maine discovered. And full disclosure here, I actually my little brother lives in Maine, and he's actually quite close friends with Damien Biebel, one of the researchers on this. And I know Damien, and I know that he's I think he looks very carefully and seriously at education technology, and I was just positive that he was going to find that they did nothing, and so I was wrong. Although I should say that these are very early results from the fact that Auburn, Maine gave one iPad to every kindergarten student, and they've been looking to see whether or not this impacted their literacy scores. And the initial results, it seems as though they had some impact. The scores were all the scores were all better for the students that had iPads, although not statistically, it wasn't statistically significant in most cases. But I think one of the other one of the things I tried to stress in my story that this isn't just a matter of magically somehow iPads appeared in Maine and now the students there are smarter, which I think at least one technology blog ran with the headline that iPads make kids smarter. It's actually that this school district has been working very hard on sort of supporting professional development around literacy and supporting the teachers in using these tools in the classroom. So this isn't just an iPads are magic story.
There was so much good in this story, right? Because of that history and push, they have years of data that
Yes.
precede the introduction of the iPad. You've got Damien talking about pedagogy and teaching, as being critical here. And then you've got research and random trials and assessments. I mean, this isn't just somebody throwing iPads in and saying, wow, magic has happened.
Right.
Clearly, this is very thoughtful. It was interesting though. At that point, I'm really jazzed up, and then, you read the non-statistically important, trending positive, but not statistically significant, right? And then, but there was a substantial increase in scores on the hearing and recording sounds in words test.
Yes.
And I thought, well, this is interesting. This is really, really targeted. So is this the case of good news appearing somewhere that wasn't fully expected? And if so, is this the kind of news that then allows for sort of deep thought around that particular concern in teaching and learning, rather than kind of the magic carpet, this is going to lift everything?
I should say here too. I mean, I think that again, this is sort of really early results from what we're seeing in Maine. And even though I got on the phone with Mike Muir and Damien and Sue Doris, a principal at one of the schools, and we talked about this. And I think that they're all pretty excited about what they've discovered. I should say that they aren't going to be releasing sort of the full information till the end of the year. So this is an early glimpse at what's happening with these students. And I'm trying to be cautionary, because I think that it's so easy for us to sort of say this is, here we have the ammo that every school district in America now needs to sort of find money in their budget to do just this. And I think that I don't think that that's what we found. But I think it raises some interesting questions about what is it about the iPad that would affect that sort of phonetical awareness, right? What is it that it has? Is it that it has a read aloud capability in a way that with some one-on-one time that a student wouldn't ordinarily get in the classroom? I don't know.
I really like the direction this story takes us in terms of thinking deeply about the impact, and so kudos to them. Okay, your history of e-learning. This last week I talked to a language teacher who was amazed at how well teaching languages worked in a distance learning environment, granted asynchronous and synchronous. But tell us about your history here.
Well, this is,
which was a very candid history, by the way.
It was a very candid history, but I think, trying to be transparent, particularly now that I'm doing this research project for Mozilla, which is not directly related to this, but it is somewhat. And I think that, I think being honest about our own experiences with teaching and learning it's often one of these unspoken things. I think particularly when it comes to education entrepreneurs that sort of take their own experience as the universal one for granted, right? That they had, they had a terrible math teacher, therefore all math teachers are terrible, therefore Saul Khan is the savior of math. Like, these are the sort of chain of equivalencies that I hear all the time. So I've been thinking a lot about sort of my own experiences in learning, and I wanted to spend some time thinking about what it means to learn through a video. And I had an experience in college because I did drop out of school after a couple of years in college, and ended up doing most of my degree in a distance learning. At the time, it really was sort of distance learning. And I had a correspondence course that was all video. And just thinking about what it means, sort of the promise that we hear now, particularly around SalCon, that the ability to sort of hit pause and rewind is a technological advance. I mean, I think that my story is 20 years ago, and so this isn't a technological advance necessarily. So I just wanted to sort of spend some time thinking about my own experiences learning statistics in this case, which I'm sure, as anybody who's read any of my stories know, that I do sort of struggle with. I do need help when it comes to sort of the p-value of a particular test out of Maine, for example. What does that mean? I don't remember.
Having never even taken statistics, I'm going to just let that one kind of quietly go by. But there were some comments. I noticed that the first comment right off the bat was, I mean, this is not unique to this subject or to this way of studying. So much of what gets learned in our kind of current structured school system does not get remembered.
True. I think that is true, and I think that we need to sort of, is that because it's a lecture, right? I mean, is there something about the lecture? Because as I made clear after taking Introduction to Statistics, I took an SPSS class, which is a statistical software class, and I did very well in that. It was more hands-on. It was in a face-to-face setting, but it was very hands-on. I applied the knowledge I should have had from statistics to sort of solve actual problems. And so, again, so these are sort of why I'm sort of telling these stories, to sort of work through in my own head, at least for me, what worked. Because watching a video didn't really give me any deep conceptual understanding of statistics.
Okay, I think I counted 4 posts this week on this HTML5 project.
Yes.
The Scratch. So what is Scratch for HTML5, and why would your readers even care?
Well, I think that's a very good question, actually. I think that so Mozilla has asked me to conduct a research project. They're interested in helping boost web literacy, and I think Scratch for HTML5 is sort of shorthand for the kind of tool that they'd like, that they're wondering if they should build. And the Scratch part of that equation is a tool for novices, something that doesn't require programming knowledge, but that takes you through thinking, through sort of learning some of the foundational concepts to make a gateway into programming. So Scratch is an MIT Media Lab project that teaches computational thinking. Has a graphic interface, and it's very easy for quite young children to learn to program and make games and animation with it. So is there a way to make a tool like that to help people, novices, children or adults, learn HTML5? And of course, HTML5 is the latest version of HTML, and it's HTML plus CSS plus some JavaScript and a whole bunch of other sort of powerful programmatic things that aren't in earlier versions of HTML. So sort of, can we build a tool to help get folks building for the web?
So a lot of interesting comments here. Maybe we can kind of lump them all together. But I was particularly struck by Julie Maloney's questions about whether or not this was authentic work.
Yes. And
whether or not teaching HTML5 is actually the right place to begin teaching computational thinking.
I think that Julie raised a number of really important questions about this project. And I should say right now, this is very much exploratory. Sort of Mozilla have sort of told me to sort of go out and talk to as many smart people about this as I can, which is great because I'm able to talk to folks who I know have spent time sort of teaching teaching young students computer science, folks who and folks who sort of teach HTML. And in the case of Julie, she actually is the person who taught me HTML. But I think she raises an interesting point about sort of where is the demand right now, and don't we still need to sort of get folks really up to speed on HTML and how the web works before we sort of dash off down the rabbit hole of HTML5?
Yeah, I almost even heard kind of the Seymour Papert clapping in the background. Julie's comments, right? I mean, that you need to really be thinking about what's important to be teaching and at what place you start. I also felt like I was hearing Richard Stallman clapping in the background when Glenn Bull talks about the tension between openness and proprietary.
Yes.
And sort of the impact on education of the sort of proprietary structure of apps.
Well, and I think that I was very happy actually to start off this series of interviews with talking with Glenn Bull, and I think that because he has this really long history in thinking about this very subject, but he made a couple of really important points about sort of what happens when our both the technology that we're using in schools and the technology we're building for schools move to native apps and move into these walled gardens, even on the web, move into these walled gardens on the web. And sort of how can we, because there are actually lots of tools that make it very easy to build native mobile apps. I mean, interestingly, Google's own Scratch-like tool is Android App Inventor. So they aren't teaching students how to build web apps or websites. They're teaching you how to build Android apps. And sort of you don't have to be too cynical to sort of know why that might be. I mean, somewhat cynical maybe, but I think it's important. It's important to think about where our development energy is going to, in terms of who's building, what they're building, and what devices they work on.
The elephant in the room for me on this is still this question of you can build this tool, or you can provide the opportunity for this to be taking place in schools, but is it actually going to have much of an impact on the current ed climate? And maybe that's not fair, because even with Scratch's sort of broad adoption, well, it's not necessarily broad adoption. Let's say Scratch has some good level of adoption. It doesn't feel like it's very broad. It doesn't feel like it's impacting our larger sense of what should take place in education. Is there anything to distinguish this idea, the Mozilla Scratch for HTML5 idea, that would have more impact than Scratch has had?
Well, I don't know. I think that that's a really good and important question. I mean, I do wonder if, I feel like we still have to do a lot of explaining even what we mean by computational thinking and why computational thinking matters. Although I hope that that's the larger argument too, that people are will sort of pay attention to what skills are we sort of really missing. And I don't mean a technical skill like knowing how to use Excel, for example, or but I mean the sort of computational thinking and the importance of logic and systematic ways of thinking that aren't. I think that's the potential there for huge change lies in something like Scratch.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I'll have to think about that. I mean, I love Scratch, and I've loved what they've done, but I don't feel as though it's actually impacting the larger narratives or ideas about education, and that's probably not fair. I did love Vanessa Gennarelli's kind of focus on the importance of a community, authentic audience.
Yeah, we actually ended up. I think it was and she's a grad student at Harvard, but she's working in the Media Lab this term as her research project. And we ended up talking about sort of writing for the web, which I think we shouldn't divorce that from programming or building for the web shouldn't sort of not be writing for the web. So I think our conversation went down a really different path in which we were exactly, we were talking about what does it mean to sort of do your work with an audience, with the web, for the web in this way. We were thinking about it in terms of writing, but I think that same thing ideally should hold true with any web building endeavor.
Yeah, which sort of consistently reminds me of all these interviews I did on open source and how all of that work was done outside of the traditional school system, and how it feels as though some of the most authentic work students are doing, whether it's something on YouTube or writing they're doing for fan fiction, that so much of this is actually taking place outside of schools because it's authentic and because there's a real community.
Right. And I think, that, the partially because there's not the expectation to sort of have every exercise be one move towards upping the standardized test score. I mean, I think that that's why some of these after school projects and library projects that I see are so exciting, is because no one's overtly sort of talking about how this is going to sort of boost student achievement on the next standardized math test.
Phil Wagner says, if I remember correctly, sort of directly, you don't need to emphasize badges, contests, or points, but rather project-based learning.
Yes,
and I loved that.
I love that too, and I think that I think that I think that, but I think that the trick, and one of the things that I think Phil is working on, is sort of how do we help put the tools into sort of put the right tools into the hands of both students and teachers, so that they actually can build the things they do, so that they can whether it's, build a website, or he's created a very cool little Android app to make it easier for physics students to collect data. Sort of how can we help sort of build better tools and get them into folks' hands, so that the incentive doesn't have to be a badge, that you actually have that we can sort of tap into sort of students' own curiosity and inquiry without having to sort of reward them with these other things.
Was it Phil who said by the end I should have a website?
Yes.
Okay, I had a great idea. Well, no, I had an idea. I can't say it's a great idea. I had an idea, though. But it would seem to me that if the outcome of this, or the result, was some kind of product independent of the school, like a learning profile or a personal portfolio or something, that in fact that would be kind of a brilliant way to merge the two worlds. That if in fact the end result was so tangibly valuable to the learner outside of the traditional education system, outside of it but informing their work in regular schools, that would be really powerful.
Well, and I have to wonder too about how much, when we think about building for building, why students would want to sort of build for the web now, I think that having just that sort of site is a really powerful argument. I mean, why you want to be able to showcase your work, whatever your work is, whether it's sort of stories you've write, or photos you've taken, or programs, applications you've designed. But I think having a way that you can actually own and showcase your own work on your own website is powerful and empowering, but also, frankly, really important that you just for your sort of own professional and academic development.
Well, you and I would agree on that. But as I discovered from reading your post, Ivan Tribbles would not.
Yeah, Ivan.
That was amazing. I didn't hear that when I guess it was 2005 when that originally took place.
Right, and that was when I was, Julie and I were both graduate students, PhD students at the time, and avid bloggers, and it became very clear that there were forces within the academy, and I should say that there are still forces in the academy that saw blogging as frivolous, and that they were sort of frowned upon, that scholars would be willing to sort of open up both their sort of professional lives and their personal lives to such sort of scrutiny on the web.
That was one of the most interesting things I have read in a long time. Two really strong messages for me. One was, you better not have a hobby, right? I mean, you better not be having interest in anything other than what we think you should be interested in. And if you're human, you should hide it like the rest of us.
Well, I mean, and this is, one of the myriad reasons why I am not a professor in a university is that, the path that my life took, actually, didn't. My life was, personal things happened that, in addition to sort of distrust of the academia in general, sort of personal issues happened, and I realized that there are many people in that institution that are just like Ivan Tribble, that they don't care what's happening in your own world. You really are just pure intellect and, of course, labor to teach classes, but mostly pure intellect.
That was fascinating. Okay, I was at the 10-year anniversary meeting for the Horizons report, and I was very interested in your post on this because they've just released the EdTech version, this version for EdTech of the Horizon report, or sorry,
higher ed, right?
For the Horizon report. But I couldn't really tell what your take was on this.
Well, the Horizon, I don't know. I mean, the Horizon report is sort of always interesting to me to sort of read it and see what the sort of the committee has decided are the technologies that they see as sort of coming soon or sort of on the horizon but in the distance, and it's sort of interesting to watch over time. One of the things I wish that they would do is sort of say in each Horizon report list what's been on their horizon and what's come and gone from their report, and sort of so we can see like that there are some things that have been on the horizon forever, and then they're sort of the next year the report will come around and sort of it's not there. And sort of thinking about like, well, what happened? Is it that these technologies have been widely adopted? Did we decide that they were no longer interesting or pertinent? I think like augmented reality is a great one. Like that, for a couple of years, augmented reality was listed on on the horizon, 3 to 5 years on the horizon, and it's not on the it's nowhere. It's not mentioned specifically in this latest report. So just thinking about like what does the metaphor of the horizon mean in terms of technology? That's where we sort of never quite get there. It's always in the distance. No matter where you stand positionally changes what you think the horizon is or could be. And it's just thinking about things are sort of always things feel always out of reach in ed tech. I think that the Horizon Report's metaphor just is a good reminder of that.
Well, that was clever. I mean, you kind of need to know how the report is generated, which is each year a group of people get together and they talk about what they think the trends are. And then I didn't really fully understand the value of the report, until I talked to some people who are at universities who said, we need to be thinking a couple of years ahead in terms of our planning for what we're going to do. But I was intrigued because there were 100 people gathered for this 10-year activity. And they allowed us to do a fair amount of brainstorming. And they asked us what we thought were sort of the most significant trends. And I raised my hand and said deinstitutionalization. Right? And it touched on 5 or 6 of the other trends that were up on the board already. And I think, I can't speak for everybody who was in the room, but there were several people who said, wow, that really sort of ties a lot of these together. So I was really interested when the report came back from the 10-year meeting, and it didn't mention deinstitutionalization at all. And I thought, Larry's going to come on the Future of Education show, and I get to ask him this question. But this isn't fully a democratic report when all is said and done. I mean, there's a staff that you kind of go through this. And I actually kind of left feeling like deinstitutionalization is not necessarily a message that is going to be welcomed by those in institutions who are reading the report.
Yeah, good observation, Steve.
I don't know. Could be.
No, but I think I was fascinated by this year's report too. And again, like I think to me, it's this very strange sort of document, and maybe partially because it is sort of somewhat assembled by committee. But some of the things are always like no-brainers that they're that they're there, and then some of them sort of seem that they're sort of strangely in the distance when really they're closer, or closer than perhaps they're being accounted for here. But I thought that it was that this year the things that are sort of right on the horizon are mobile apps and tablet computing, and I thought that that was a I thought that that was an interesting.
Shocker.
Well, I thought that was a shocker. I know it's like, but then too, sort of thinking about the resistance that I've heard, particularly among students to eat to digital textbooks, and I thought, sort of, how do you reconcile the fact that these are such hot trends? And I'm not saying that students don't want tablets, but I think that students are saying, oh, we want tablets, but we still actually prefer our printed textbooks. And so it is interesting to think about sort of what's what are the institutional and industry impulses versus what students are finding interesting.
Okay, well said. Let's move into the news. Help me to understand the No and Cengage lawsuit.
Oh, this is a mess.
Is it when you said highlights? Is that the act of being able to highlight text?
Yes. So this is a very strange and potentially quite a troubling development if Cengage sort of forces the issue on this. So to back up, so No is of course the app. They make an app, a digital textbook app. They're not a publisher themselves, but they have deals with the major textbook publishers to have their content in the app. Cengage is a publisher, and when No introduced highlights, so the ability to sort of highlight and share text, Cengage pulled their content from the No app. So saying that this was that the act of highlighting and sharing highlights was copyright infringement, and No is now suing for breach of contract. So the No lawsuit is about Cengage breach of contract, but Cengage is apparently opposing this notion of highlighting, sharing your highlights, which I don't understand how that could not be fair use, but.
So Amazon does it.
Amazon does do it.
I wonder if there's an issue there as well.
Although I think that Amazon, the Kindle Amazon highlights, I don't know if it's that No is somehow doing something else and collecting the highlights for other purposes. But it certainly seems like if the notion of sharing your highlights is copyright infringement, we're in a world of hurt.
Yeah, I was surprised and intrigued. What does it matter that library.nu shut down?
This was, I think that this was a website where that a lot of folks would turn to for, in some cases, pirated ebooks. But it was actually a place where you could find a lot of academic works outside paywalls, and it was actually a major BitTorrent site for the developing world. So this was a place. This was sort of like the in many places around the world where it's difficult to get access to textbooks because of licensing issues. And that library, this website was one that many folks would turn to in other parts of the world, particularly in Russia. And I guess that's not really the developing world, but in other parts in Africa as well. So this was a popular site, not so much in the United States, although students knew they could sort of find pirated textbooks there. But it was actually a resource internationally for academic content.
So, kind of a difficult story, right? I mean, you can't necessarily justify that behavior,
right?
But it should be telling us something.
Well, I think that if you talk to, you'll often hear folks who want to read a particular ebook, and they don't have access to the ebook in their country. I mean, there's even difficulty getting access to ebooks if you're a Canadian. You can't purchase every book that's available on the Kindle through the Canadian store. So the publishers have the licensing around digital material is restricted country to country, so it's difficult. In fact, this is so bad for me to admit it, but I will. He's my cousin. My cousin has written a book. He's British. His book is available only on the Kindle if you're British, or if you buy it from the British store. So I can't actually get my cousin Marcus's book on my Kindle since I'm American. So I actually was looking for places to download it, but I guess I'll read the printed version instead.
Of course you will. I did note it that I don't know if it was this week, but I do know that Paulo Coelho, the famous Brazilian writer,
right,
has allowed all of his works to be released on what was Pirate Bay.
Right, and I think it's the same. It's the same sort of gesture, knowing that people. I think that most people that pirate, they aren't sort of doing it to be malicious. Like I would buy Marcus's book, but if I can't get it, what are my options? My options are probably to go to a BitTorrent site and download it.
Right, and in the past we would have said, you just can't get it.
Right.
But now we have this expectation that the knowledge should be a little bit freer than that, and I actually feel like that's a positive impulse. I mean, I guess we're going to have to really work out the legalities of it, but I think that this idea that there's so much that I learn from these digital, the easy access to so much material right now, that it does seem a little unfair to not have it available. And so hopefully we push more towards that in ways that everybody feels are appropriate,
right,
or we figure that out.
Right.
A little more detail on the Harvard Library restructuring. Is this less dramatic than we thought?
It still seems like it's rather dramatic. And again, one to watch. The Harvard Research Library is offering early retirement to librarians over 55, and it looks as though they're actually switching a lot of the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure of the library, over to the university's IT department instead of having it run from within the library itself. So again, another interesting it's sort of hard to know how much is sort of departmental power play, how much is budgetary, and how much is sort of hype and hullabaloo. But it does look as though there's some massive restructuring. And again, seeing the technology move outside the control of the librarians is disconcerting. As is, of course, mass layoffs.
Right. This is this ongoing story for us. Wikipedia's limitations. This was interesting to me because I've actually had the same response to Wikipedia, which is I feel that in the move toward a neutral point of view, I sometimes wish I actually could just see the alternative views, and so that the people who had different views could work out together that alternative view, almost like a Supreme Court decision, right? I want to see the majority view, and I want to see the minority view. And I'm intrigued that, sort of in thinking deeply about it, it's true that Wikipedia doesn't really give you the full minority view.
Yeah, I think that this is a particularly interesting case too, because, this is somebody who, this was a story in the Chronicle of Higher Education, a history professor who's actually published a book on the history of the Haymarket affair, and his view is a minority view. But sort of he's published the book and he has sort of extensive research about it, and he's struggled to get the right information up on Wikipedia. And it's interesting now that Wikipedia has changed. They have sort of changed this entry to reflect his views. But I think that in Wikipedia's defense here, I think that it is good to remember that I think these sort of machinations happen all the time, and you can sort of look at some of the history and see on a particular article when there's been controversy. Do they need to add more transparency so you can see sort of more about why edits have happened or not? Perhaps they do. Perhaps it's, again, part of this larger effort, I think, that we need to sort of educate people how Wikipedia and this collaborative encyclopedia writing actually happens, too. And probably more of us get involved in editing it, so it isn't just a small group of volunteers.
interesting. My favorite magazine to read is one called The Week, and typically it gives the both or the multiple varieties of viewpoints with a little bit of depth, and I like that. And so maybe I'm off base. Maybe I'm not thinking about Wikipedia in the right way, but I feel like the neutral point of view doesn't necessarily always allow the full flowering of the minority views.
Right.
So I actually would kind of be interested in seeing how that shifts. Okay, tell us about Girl Scouts and why they like hands-on STEM but are not as excited about career STEM.
So the Girl Scouts of America conducted a research, an interesting research thing about girls' attitudes to STEM. And girls, I think despite some of the stereotypes, girls love science. The research found that they particularly love doing hands-on projects. They love problem solving, but despite being really excited, and despite the research saying the girls knew that they were smart enough to pursue sort of careers and majors in STEM, a lot of them said they had no interest in doing so. And so I think it's, again, part of these struggles that we're facing in getting, appealing to sort of demographics who haven't been attracted to STEM majors and STEM careers. How can we get them involved? Because clearly it's not a matter of interest. There's still something missing. And according to this research, one of the reasons that the girls said they weren't interested in it, it's actually because they said there were sort of too many boys in STEM careers. So it's this sort of vicious cycle that we can't seem to escape from, where the room is full of boys and few girls want to enter.
Fascinating. The New York Times study on education, gap between the rich and the poor. What did it show?
We spent a lot of time, I think, talking about some of the racial divide in this country, the achievement gap between white kids and kids of color. But according to some of the latest research, it's really the achievement gap between rich and poor that is growing, and frighteningly so. And to me, this is sort of in some ways it feels very much like a no-brainer. And I think that we really don't talk enough about the ways in which poverty impacts educational opportunity. And I don't know if a New York Times study or a story will help bring the discussion to the forefront, but I do feel like this is sort of a missing piece that we sort of neglect to talk about when we talk about why some children aren't performing well in school. The answer seems less about the school itself and about sort of issues of poverty.
I did interview that guy, Mitch Pearlstein, on the impact of the family on education. Mm-hmm. Has anybody, to your awareness, looked at kind of sussing out the connection or the connections or the differences between poverty and family structure? And how much of what we call poverty is actually difficult family structure, and how much of it is actually just the fact that it's poverty?
Yeah, I don't know. Nothing comes to mind right off the top of my head, but I'm not sure.
I'll have to keep looking at that. Yeah. So Google's code-in competition.
Yeah, I like that.
What is it, who won, and why, and what?
This is a great, Google has a number of really cool programs that they do through their open source office. This is one of them. They announced the winners this week. It's an online hackathon of sorts, a coding competition for high school, middle school, high school age students. And 525 students entered, and they picked the winners this year. It was interesting to look at the location of where the winners come from. A lot from India, for example, and sort of thinking about where where do we see sort of the future software programming hotspots, and are they in? Is this the UK in particular has been sort of up in arms about its IT education, sort of thinking about what are we sort of not doing well in getting sort of future students to become programmers.
And finally, you have more recommended reading.
I do.
And one is a recommended watch.
Yes.
The Brett Victor and Guiding Principles. That blew me away.
Yeah, it blew me away too. And I thought, well, I don't have to do this work for Mozilla anymore because that right there.
So he's talking about, and I just watched the portion that you
Yeah.
recommended, like minutes 3 to 16 or something. And he's talking about actually being able to get feedback from the coding work. But he says this isn't just related to programming. And he
Right.
makes it clear this is sort of a broader lesson. For
Lesson
me,
in
the
creativity.
takeaway.
It was, yeah.
Yes. The takeaway for me was creation, feedback, and discovery.
Yes.
And and I felt like that was such a good encapsulation of learning, and especially the ways in which technology is impacting learning, whether it's programming or it's being able to do these things on the web.
Well, I mean, I think I really cannot recommend this video. I can't recommend it highly enough. My sort of jaw has been on the floor all week after seeing it. Because I think that there's something in what he's talking about in terms of tapping into creativity that I worry we don't uncover when we're sort of moving through the world of the WYSIWYG, and we don't uncover when we're thinking about code just in terms of code and not in terms of art. And I think just thinking about how can we make the most of technology tools to sort of help uncover sort of creative insights that we never would have ordinarily stumbled across if we sort of worked through creation as usual, our own sort of whatever our sort of current tools are that we use to create, whether that's a pencil and paper. Sort of how can we enhance the creative spark? It's really interesting talk.
Audrey, another great week.
Yes.
Thanks for being prolific.
Well, you're welcome.
Anyway, have a great week, everybody.
All right.
Thanks, Audrey.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.